Welcome to Lawyerpreneur, where we discuss creativity, entrepreneurship, and other trailblazing that enables us to distinguish ourselves from others, because being a lawyer doesn't have to mean doing business as usual. I am your host, Jeremy Richter. Today's episode is brought to you by Alps, who wishes you a happy spring. After a year that was anything but easy, Alps is committed to bringing ease to insurance. Alps is the nation's largest direct writer of lawyers' malpractice insurance. That means you have direct access to your insurance team, from account managers to claims attorneys. And Alps has the simplest, most straightforward online application out there. Qualifying firms can even apply, see rates, and bind coverage all in about 20 minutes. When it comes to continuing your coverage, Alps makes that easy too, with 100% online renewal. With Alps, you can spend less time insurancing and more time innovating. Get started at applyonline.alpsinsurance.com. That's applyonline.alpsinsurance.com. In addition to the corporate sponsorship that helps pay for the hosting and transcription of the show, you can support Lawyerpreneur on Patreon at patreon.com/lawyerpreneur. For less than the cost of a .1, you can help pay for the time it takes to create and edit Lawyerpreneur and receive copies of my two most recent books, Stop Putting Out Fires and Level Up Your Law Practice. Now, on to the show. All right, welcome to episode 47 of Lawyerpreneur. This is going to be a bit of a different episode in that I have just released my first novel, which I wrote under the pen name J.W. Judge, and we'll talk about, I think, the reasons for that in this episode. But I have asked Lilly to come back to actually interview me for the podcast. And you can find Lisa's interview that we did last year. It is episode 19. And we talked about her fiction writing, her nonfiction writing, and I can definitely recommend her nonfiction books for writers. I have read and used super simple story structure in my own writing and found it really useful and practical. And so I am going to turn over the reins to Lisa, who's going to interview me in my capacity as a fiction writer as J.W. Judge. So Lisa, thanks for being here and doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm a big fan of Vulcan Rising, so it's exciting to get to talk to you about it. And I'm glad to hear that super simple story structure has been helpful to you.
Yes, and I really liked particularly the use of Terminator among the illustrations. I really connected with that, so that was good.
Still my favorite movie.
I've been looking, since I read it several months ago, I have been looking for where Terminator is streaming anywhere so that I can go back and watch Terminator and then T2, but so far it hasn't been anywhere.
Oh, interesting. I haven't watched it in a while, but I am old school and have the DVDs.
Oh, there you go.
I've not looked for it streaming. All right. Well, so on Vulcan Rising, why don't we start with where you got the idea for the story?
Okay, so in January of 2020, I had this really bizarre dream. And for as long as I can remember, I have had very vivid and sometimes really random, weird dreams. And for a while, I wrote them down, but that just seemed to make them more vivid and darker and stranger, so I quit. But then I had this dream, and I wrote it down and published it as a blog post back in January of 2020. And the dream was, well, I have to remember, I've changed it now because it became a part of the book. But as best I remember, the dream was that in the middle of the night, I heard a noise. And I looked out the window and I didn't see anything. Everything was dark. There were woods behind my house. And so I look in the woods and I don't see anything. But then I see two guys walking into the woods behind the house, and that's not normal. So I get my handgun and go out the front door, just tell my wife I'm going to check on something. slide around the side of the house because I then hear an animal noise. So then I'm just waiting because I don't know what's happening. Everything's really strange. And then three guys come out of the woods, and one of the guys is carrying something, but it's nighttime and I can't see what it's carrying, but it's big. And then they get to the driveway and I tell them to stop and see that the guy is carrying something that looks like a horse, but it's not a horse, but it definitely looks like a horse shape. And then they get really aggressive. There's an altercation. I shoot one of them. I tell the other guy to set the horse down, and then they leave and carry the guy off who's been shot. And it's a Pegasus, not a horse. So going back to our Greek mythology, Pegasus is the winged horse. And then I've got to figure out what to do with this thing. And that's where I woke up. And so I wrote that down, and that was it for a while. Later in January, trying to remember what happened next. My 5-year-old called me up to his room and said that he felt something on the bed. And I was like, oh no, we have another water leak, because this is what happened months before. We'd had a water leak during a storm, and it had been on his bed and poured water onto his bed. So that was a fun surprise for everybody. So he said, then I realized it's not a water leak because it's not raining, and I fixed the leak. And so I feel around the bed. There's nothing there. Like, I don't know. It was just, kids in the middle of the night. So I lay down beside him and my mind starts racing. I'm like, okay, I can't sleep. And I just start thinking about, like, what if there were a mythical creature that could show up and help soothe kids back to sleep? And so that, sparked this just random scene about this mythical red panda who shows up and can talk to the boy and tell him he's going to be there to comfort him. And the kid's like, okay, I'm good now, Dad, you can go downstairs. So
That's
I wrote
great.
that.
So you have two mythical creatures hanging out in your head.
Yeah.
And somehow this comes together.
Yes. But it doesn't come together for another 7 months.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, so I write those things down, put them out as blog posts on my writing blog, expectantwriter.com, and just leave them. So then in August of 2020, one morning, my son comes downstairs. I get up early, and he's also an early riser too. And so he comes downstairs and like snuggles up right beside me and is quiet and kind of just acting strange. And I ask him, is everything okay? And he says, yes. But then, like, for whatever reason, the muse put an idea in my head of, like, what if he saw this weird shadow creature on the stairs? And so I made up this scene for that. And by the time I finished that, I was like, okay, these three things, there's something here. And those all became early chapters of Vulcan Rising, which I wrote over the next 3.5 months, and just like wrote relentlessly until I finished it, or at least finished the first draft of several drafts in December of last year.
That's pretty fast, especially because I know that you are a busy lawyer who is
yes,
often in the courtroom or at work in your office. So how did you fit that in?
So for years now, I've gotten up at 5 a.m. Even on the weekends, like, my brain just turns on now. It's so habitual that, like, alarm clock or not, my brain just turns itself on and I'm up. So I get up at 5. A lot of times, over the years, that has been either writing for my law blog. Sometimes it's work, depending on what's, going on with the law practice. Other times it was things for this podcast. But for those 3.5 months, that was the time that I spent writing the book. And I had started and bailed on, at least temporarily, 2 other novels before this one. And I had really thought that I would finish one of those other ones in 2020 and had planned to finish it. But after the pandemic hit, I could not find creative energy for writing fiction for a while. It wasn't there, and I couldn't force the issue. But then in August, I wrote those three things down and started writing, and everything just, I'm not going to say it was easy. It absolutely wasn't easy, but it was fun. And I had a good time with it. So, sometimes it was early in the morning. Sometimes it was sitting in court waiting on things to get started, or in a grocery line. I use Scrivener. So I have the app on my phone and it syncs with my laptop. So I can do 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there and know that when I get back, it's all going to sync up and I can just pick up. So it was a lot of stolen time in addition to the time that I set up for it to do it.
And what do you think it was? And maybe it's what you said about it being fun, but was there something about the premise of this story that you think grabbed you at that moment more so than the other two that you had already in the works?
I don't know. I mean, part of it was one of the ones that I've started writing was a historical novel based on some really dark family history. And I don't think I'd need to do some more research on it because it's set in 1940, right before we join, or I guess 41, right before we join World War II, right before Pearl Harbor and all that. So I need to get all the historical context right. And I wasn't ready, honestly. And the other one, it just kind of trailed off a little bit. And this was, I don't know, when I had that third event that turned into one of the chapters, it just set off a fire that I just kept burning and kept going until I was done.
And I loved that opening chapter, that scene with the woods and the creature and these guys going, back to the woods. I found that very compelling. It drew me right in. I probably should have asked you this first. How would you describe the plot or the premise? Like, do you have a tagline for the book?
All right, so I do. And I'll tell you, writing the blurb for the back copy and writing taglines is as difficult for me as writing the book itself.
I completely agree with you.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. Because that's been true for my nonfiction stuff too. It's just like, that stuff is work.
Right. I'd rather write an 80,000 word novel.
Yes. All right. So the tagline is, if I get it right here, even your darkest or most deeply buried secrets can find their way back to you.
Nice.
And the reason for that is, so the main character is Joseph, and he's just like, he's a dude. He's a dad. He has a young kid, and he's living what he thinks is a normal life. And he learns fairly early on that things aren't normal, and he just didn't know it. And his wife is the one that is carrying secrets that are going to drag him into this world that he knew nothing about. And so that's where the tagline is, because she's got secrets and she thought they were buried and gone, and they're going to resurrect themselves. And I'll tell you, I had one of my lawyer friends who is a voracious reader and used to be a teacher like I did. I talked to her early on about this book, and she became effectively my developmental editor as we went through this. And I just kept her in the loop and we talked about things. And I thought when I started writing this, that Joseph, the dad, was going to be the main character, and that this was going to be a book about him, and everybody else was going to be side characters. But she pointed out to me that Agatha, the wife, has the potential to be way more interesting. And I hadn't realized it until she said that. And when she said that, the book took a whole different direction and became way more compelling, because the characters had, I had her who knew about this world and the husband who's learning about it. So she can guide him, but also, like, she's really awesome. And it's like, and so they just became a lot less flat of characters and had more depth to them. And I attribute a lot of that to that suggestion that she can be more interesting of the two, in giving the book that direction and that depth that I don't think it would have had otherwise.
So I'm curious because one of my questions for you was why you chose to tell it as a multiple viewpoint story. You've got at least the three, the
Yeah.
Joseph and Agatha and their son. And is that how it started out? Or did you start out just with Joseph's point of view?
I thought that it was just going to be Joseph's point of view. But then once I involved Agatha, and I wanted it to be a limited perspective where whoever's head you're in, you can know their thoughts, but you don't know everybody else's thoughts. And so I didn't want the narrator to be omniscient.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I had parts of the story that he didn't know and wasn't present for, and they were interesting and needed to be told. And so then I added Agatha into the fold as point of view characters. And then as we get into it, there are things that neither of them are present for that happen. And Thomas needed to be the one who told that. And I'd considered, for Thomas's point of view, there are other choices I could have made about who that was going to be to tell that part of the story. But I thought it would be an interesting exercise to try to write from the perspective of a 6-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it worked. So that's.
I thought it worked very well. I
good.
really enjoyed that, seeing things through his eyes as well. And I thought you did a great job of how he's perceiving these, he sees things his dad doesn't, but he also kind of has this empathy for both of his parents.
Well, good. But yeah, that's how that came about. It wasn't necessarily planned. I mean, I started planning more as I wrote it, particularly when I got well into like the second act and realized, okay, we're at the point now where I've written everything I knew was going to happen, and I need to figure out what happens next. And so that's where I used your book. And I had read Story Grid by Sean Coyne and listened to his podcast. And he had a book called Action Story, which talks about action stories, which I think this fits into. And he sets out all of the obligatory scenes and the things you need to hit as you write one of these. And so I used, those structure books as a framework to figure out what I need to do in the rest of the story to make this work and meet the reader's expectations, whether it's conscious or subconscious expectations of, in this type of story, these are the things that happen. And I needed to hit all those beats. So I used those structures once I got to the point where I'm not really sure what to do next. I think I know where we're going, but I'm not sure how to get there. I use those frameworks to help me fill in those gaps.
Now, did you know as you were writing that this was going to be a series?
No. I figured, like everything else, I figured it out as I went. And I even late into it, I didn't know how it was going to end. And it ended up not ending the way I thought it was going to end, which may sound really, like, for people who don't write, that may sound ridiculous. Because there's a lot of times I'm writing a scene and I'm not sure what's going to happen in it. And the people start having a conversation. The characters start having a conversation that I don't know where it's going to go. And I'm just making it up as I go. Right. And so when I realized that the ending to the book wasn't going to be what I thought it was, then I realized, okay, I need to make some decisions here about what's going to happen. So at that point, I decided, okay, this is going to be 3 books. And I'm right now, as we record in June of 2021, I've written half of the sequel. And I think I have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. Although I could be surprised, but I've plotted out the major points for the rest of the book. And then I think I have a pretty good understanding of the major things that are going to happen in the 3rd book that are going to close out this trilogy. But more recently, I've had ideas for a 4th and a 5th book that include some of the same characters and it's set in the same universe. So who knows? I don't know how many we're going to end up with, but I am sure that we're going to have a trilogy that completes this big story arc, and then we'll see what comes after that.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I can empathize with that experience of when I did my first supernatural thriller. Even as I was deciding what to do with it and to publish it, I still partly saw it as a standalone. And then as I was looking to the future, I thought, no, I think I'll make it a series, which was a good thing because the ending was less conclusive than maybe it should have been if it were going to be a standalone, but it worked great to transition to the next.
And so how many books are you into in that one now?
So there's 4, and that is finished. So there's 4 books total in it. And once I started that second book, I knew, oh, this is going to take me 4 books to do. And then I have a separate mystery series that's just open-ended. There's no, each one is self-contained more so. And that's kind of fun in a different way to drop in, where someone can drop in at any point in the series.
Yeah. I feel like there are a lot of mystery series that are that way, that like they're indefinite, like there may be 5 books or 20 and you can start and stop among any of them. Is that something that, to me, that seems maybe not unique to mysteries, but it's certainly an aspect of that genre that's different from a lot of others.
I agree. I think it is more common with mysteries where you have, especially if you have that one continuing character, and usually there are through lines for the characters. So you might want to read it in order to get the subplots and the personal lives. But yes, and maybe it's just because I'm drawn to mystery. Maybe it does take place in other genres, but I feel like that's where I've noticed it the most, where like the thrillers, what you're writing, my initial series do seem to be more big story arcs that take place over several books and then conclude. I love your idea though of finishing the trilogy, but then doing more in that same universe. So I'm taking it that would still be part of the Zoberry Chronicles.
I think so. Or at least that's how it's formulating in my head. And I'll tell you what's kind of fun about it is each of them seems, I'm trying to figure out how to word this. So the first book here is dark fantasy. The second book is too, but the antagonist is a serial killer. And so within this, magical universe. And so, that's different. I see the third book as being more like an action adventure story. So they're all set in the same universe. But for me, I get to keep exploring new ways of writing and telling different kinds of stories still within the same universe. Hopefully that works and people like it, but it's certainly on the writing end of it, it keeps things really interesting. And it certainly keeps me from feeling like I'm getting into a mold or a pattern, because they're not going to go that way.
Do you have a title for the second one yet?
Yeah. So the second book is called Walls Ascending. And there's a couple layers to that. Walls is the character's last name. Nope, I said Walls Ascending. Is that right? Hang on, I have to think about it. Yes, Walls Ascending. So Walls is their last name. But also we see Thomas growing up a lot in this next book, in book 2. And I think it just works on a couple of different levels.
So you mentioned before you do other kinds of writing, you do some nonfiction writing. So does your process for writing a novel, is that different, and how than the nonfiction writing?
I will tell you that the fiction writing is way more fun. It's harder in that you're just making everything up. And it still requires research. So this first book, Vulcan Rising, is set in Birmingham. And so while I'm writing it, things that occur in Birmingham and around, I'm having to look at maps. I'm having to research some things about Birmingham to make sure I get them right. So there's still that analytical research side of making sure the things that are true need to be true, um, because it's set within a real world and a real time and place. Um, but you're making so many decisions for things that the characters are doing and saying and thinking and how they're interacting with each other and what things look and smell and feel like, that it's a lot more tiring for my brain than the nonfiction stuff, which is a lot more grounded in reality.
Yeah, it's interesting because you put that so well. The idea that fiction is more fun, but also more work in one way. And I find nonfiction, it's quicker in some ways, but the fiction is, yeah, it's just more of a fun thing I would do, whether anyone bought it or not. Obviously,
Yes.
I wouldn't buy it, but the nonfiction is, yeah, I enjoy it, but would I write it if no one were interested? Probably not.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too, is like I've got several nonfiction book ideas that have been percolating for a while, and I just haven't been able to pull myself away from this novel writing stuff because I'm enjoying it so much to write those. And I just haven't had, so I've written 3 nonfiction books, and I haven't had the same inspiration or desire to get back to that. I know I will, because there's things that I want to write about. Um, but we're not there yet. I want to get these things out in the world, and we'll come back to that eventually.
No, one last question, because you mentioned in the intro that you write under a pen name. So why the pen name, and how did you pick the pen name?
All right, so I picked the pen name because my last name, Richter, in German means judge. So I stuck with my first 2 initials, stuck judge on there. So it's still relatively close to home.
Nice.
And I also thought it sounded good. I know that's superficial, but
Yeah,
whatever.
people, it's easier to remember if something just has a nice ring to it.
Yeah. And the reason for it is because I am a lawyer and I do a lot of marketing and branding as a lawyer, and a lot of writing and podcasting and all those things in that professional space. I needed to make sure that when people Google Jeremy Richter, they need to find the lawyering stuff. Not that I think there's tons of people out there Googling me, but when there's firm stuff, yeah, but they need to find my lawyer stuff. And I didn't want to get those wires crossed. And so, I am not hiding that I am both people. I just needed a degree of separation between them, that, I thought about even just doing initials and my last name for the novel, but I needed a little more space than that. And in some ways, it's just a little more freeing to have that degree of space between them, because some of this stuff is dark, and some people think it's super weird to write about magical stuff. And so, I can separate those 2 parts of myself and feel like I'm still being true to myself and genuine. And if there are people who only want to consume one side of it, then that gives them the space to do that.
And is your nonfiction under, what name is that under?
All that's under Jeremy Richter. So the podcasting, the books, all of it's under the same name that I use for, my law practice and all that, because those things are all cohesive and serve the same purpose.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to group them together that way. Yeah, so, I did not do that, and later on, I thought, oh, that might have been a good idea. So I think you were wise.
Well, I know it cuts both ways, because I'm starting entirely over, where I have an audience for the law practice, the podcast, those nonfiction books, and the blog, and there's a mailing list and all that. With the pen name, I'm starting at 0. And so there are a lot of challenges with doing it that way. So I know that, people who have that decision to look at, there are some difficult choices to make about the pros and cons of each of those things, for sure.
So is there anything I didn't ask you, anything else you want people to know about Vulcan Rising or the series?
Go buy it.
That's a good one. Actually, that's it. Where can people buy it? That's a
All
great
right.
one.
They can get it anywhere books are sold, basically. I mean, it's not going to be on the bookshelves at your local Barnes and Noble probably, but I don't think for the last 15 months people have been buying books in stores anyway.
Right.
So whether it's the ebook, the paperback, the hardcover, wherever it is you like to get your books, you can find them. And something I did just yesterday, and I hadn't planned to do this, I had a couple of people ask me if they could get signed copies, but they weren't people who are in Birmingham. I mean, one is in Indiana and another's in Maryland, and so they're all over the place. And I didn't have a way to do it. And I was trying to figure out, should I just do signed book plates and mail those? But what I ended up doing is just setting it up on my author website at jwjudge.com, where you can order a signed book. And I've had several shipped to me so that I can just sign it and mail it to them. And I really appreciate living in a world where technology has become easy enough for website building in the last, even in the last 5 years. It's become so much easier to set something up like that, because I did it yesterday morning, just kind of on a whim. It took about an hour and a half to get it all set up and done. And then, yesterday I had 3 people who ordered signed copies off my website that I'm going to sign and mail to them. And it's done and easy. And it's not something I'd planned on. And if I'd tried to do it 10 or 15 years ago, I would have had to learn to write HTML and figure it all out on my own.
Yeah, much more challenging 10 years ago. Even just putting up a website, more challenging.
Yes.
So that's so exciting. And I love that people can get an autographed copy so easily. When we're done, I'm going to have to ask you how you did that.
Fair enough. Fair.
Yeah. Anything else about the book that you wanted to share before we say goodbye?
No, I think that's it. I'm just full steam ahead into book 2, and we'll see if it ends up the way that right now at 35,000 words that I think that it's going to, and that I've planned for it to, and we'll see if everybody cooperates.
Well, good luck with that, and congratulations on the release of Vulcan Rising.
All right. Thanks so much. And thanks for taking the time to interview me.
You're welcome.
Oh, before we go, tell people where they can find you and follow your stuff and find either your nonfiction books if they're writing or your fiction books if they need to be entertained.
Oh, sure. Yes. Thank you. LisaLilly.com. That's LisaLilly.com. You can find all my fiction there, supernatural thrillers, amateur sleuth novels. You can also find my nonfiction there, or you can go to my website specifically for writers, writingasasecondcareer.com.
All right. Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed today's show. Please take time to rate and subscribe at whatever podcatcher you're listening on. And if you want more from me, you can find me at jeremywrichter.com. You can also find me on Twitter at RichterJW. And if you want the extra audio and benefits available at Patreon, you can become a patron at patreon.com/lawyerpreneur. Thanks for listening.